Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the McGowan Theater, located in the National Archives building in Washington, D.C. I'm Doug Swanson, Visitor Services Manager for the National Archives Museum and the producer for the Noontime Lecture Series. Before we begin today's program, I'd just like to remind you of some other programs that are going to be taking place in this location in the near future. On Wednesday, June 14th at noon, David Gran will discuss his book, Killers of the Flower Moon, the Osage Murders, and the Birth of the FBI. Then on Thursday, June 15th at 7 p.m., as part of our year-long celebration of JFK's 100th birthday, we'll present the Air Force Strings Ensemble, who will offer musical selections once performed in the Kennedy White House. To find out more about these, our other programs, and our exhibits, please take one of our monthly event calendars, which you'll find in the theater lobby, or you can visit our website at www.archives.gov/calendar. Our topic for today is The Loyal Son, The War in Benjamin Franklin's House by Daniel Mark Epstein. Mr. Epstein is an award-winning poet, biographer, and dramatist whose works include the books Lincoln and Whitman, Sister Amy, and the international bestseller, The Ballad of Bob Dylan. A native of Washington, D.C., he was educated at Kenyon College. In the 1970s, his poetry first appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic Monthly, and The New Republic. His first volumes of poems were published in 1973. His plays appeared soon thereafter in regional theater and off-Broadway, and in 1978 he received the Prix de Rome for his poetry and dramatic works. His holiday stories, Star of Wonder and The Two Menorahs, have become mainstays on National Public Radio. His honors include a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship in 1974, a Guggenheim Fellowship in 1984, and an Academy Award for Lifetime Achievement from the American Academy of Arts and Letters in 2006. Please join me in welcoming Daniel Mark Epstein to the National Archives.
Thanks, Doug. Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon, and thanks for coming out. I don't know what happened to the book, but the images of William Franklin and his father, Benjamin Franklin, are on the cover of the book. That fellow who a lot of people mistake for Thomas Jefferson is actually William Franklin, Ben's illegitimate son. Some of you will be curious about what, if anything, I might have learned from studying the American Revolution and the Franklin's part in it, particularly if it might shed some light on current events. That's fair enough. We're living in a challenging period of history in 2017, and there's a lot expected of us in the near future as citizens and voters and lawmakers. So anything we can learn from our founding fathers or their biographers ought to be delivered without delay. So I'll address this urgency right now, and then I'll read you a few pages from The Loyal Son. First of all, let's try to put aside our illusions about how much these early Americans were like us and how they were different. During many years of studying this particular period of history, I was in a constant state of wonder, and I still am. So bear with me as I find my way along here. Generally speaking, those of us with a healthy interest in history tend to romanticize or even sentimentalize the people of the 18th century. I know I did. We think of them as being, by and large, morally superior to us, kinder and more generous to their neighbors. Through mists and echoes, they may appear more honest in business dealings. They may seem more faithful in family ties and relations and religion, and more charitable to widows and orphans. In those days, senior citizens held a place of honor. We imagine that the colonists were more connected as a community with common goals. We recollect them as folks ready to settle their differences with rational arguments rather than emotional rhetoric or fists and swords. Those of you who've read the letters and newspapers and diaries of the 18th century will say that Americans of 1776 possessed a superior command of language. They had greater powers of expression and comprehension than the college graduates of today. Some of these things are true, some are false, and some are half true. Let's begin with the one fact that is unassailable. The colonists of the 18th century were more literate than we are. Not by a little, they were a lot more literate. And by the way, in those days, nearly 90% of white Americans could read and write. Whether the colonists were better educated, considering the state of knowledge then, may be a matter of discussion. But their command of language, the main medium of communication and debate, were superior to ours. This is very important, and we need to bear it in mind. Now let's move on from that one concrete fact to some opinions that are partly true. At the risk of a measured generalization, I would say that the people of colonial America were more generous to their neighbors than we are. This is because they had to be. It was a matter of survival. Much of our country was in a state of siege, on and off, by the Indians and French. And in the days before modern medicine, life was more fragile. People on the frontier had to share tools and look out for one another. And few towns were far removed from the frontier, either physically or historically. Also, in a time before radio, before television and the internet, neighbors relied on one another more for entertainment than they do these days. Neighbors really are very entertaining if you get to know them. Everybody back then knew everybody's business without social media. If you've ever lived in a small town, you know how this is. In 1770, Philadelphia had 25,000 people, and Philadelphia was the biggest city in America. Were people more faithful in family relations and religion? Most people probably were. Divorce was uncommon. The church was the center of most community activities. Men like Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson were suspect because they didn't go to church very often. As for honoring fathers and mothers, there were no nursing homes back then. There weren't as many old people. Death was the main retirement plan. But such old folks as there were lived alone until they couldn't, and then they lived with their children and grandchildren, and you don't hear many complaints about it. Were they kinder or morally superior to us? I doubt it. The American people are generally kind if they are not desperate or isolated. The notion of moral levels in one person or group of people as being more moral than another is not very interesting to me. But let me repeat, the American people, now as then, are fundamentally kind, as certain Aztecs were not, and we'll let it go at that. So I guess I've gone through the list of the true and the partly false about Americans in the 18th century. I'll mention the patently false and then move on with the discussion. Were the Americans of colonial times more honest in their business dealings? No. Men and women were not more honest then. This is one thing that seems to me not to have changed at all. Given an opportunity to cheat or swindle, a person with the weakness of character to cheat or swindle would do it in 1776, just as soon as he or she would do it in 2017. Ben Franklin's success in business and politics rested upon his rare honesty and the fact that people trusted him. Finally, were those folks more likely to settle their differences with rational arguments rather than emotional rhetoric, measured words rather than pistols and swords? This is where our subject gets really interesting, and there are lessons to be learned. A few minutes ago, I stated the one indisputable fact that the American colonists of the 18th century were more literate than we are. Not a little more literate, a lot more literate. And again, almost 90% of white colonists could read and write. They had a great deal of respect for language and its ability to express the truth and expose falsehoods, to explore a premise from all angles. And so it follows, as the day follows the night, that our ancestors were more likely to settle their differences with rational arguments rather than purple rhetoric, with measured words rather than pistols and swords. This doesn't mean they always did. There were duels and blood feuds, riots and rebellions. But first there was rational argument, and usually quite a bit of it. I believe that Ben Franklin may have been one of the only prominent men of his time who avoided being challenged to a duel, and this may have had something to do with Franklin's disarming power of speech. We know that his son William was challenged to a duel at least once by another lawyer who accused him of slander, and that the challenge dissipated rather quickly into a war of words. Hamilton was not so lucky. So, given the fact that the colonists were more capable of rational argument than we are, and settling their differences with words rather than gunpowder, how do we explain this frenzy of violence that led to the War of Independence and the terrible civil war that followed in New Jersey for months after the surrender of Cornwallis at Yorktown? Where did all of that irrational energy and cruelty come from? George Washington? Thomas Jefferson? Patrick Henry? Ben Franklin? John Adams? Sam Adams? Paul Revere? Those names ring in our ears like the Liberty Bell. No taxation without representation. Give me liberty or give me death. We learn these names and phrases in grade school, and they give us the idea that these heroes produced and directed the American Revolution and our nation's independence on July 4th, these men and others like them. But what about these names? Samuel Gray, James Caldwell, Samuel Maverick, Crispus Attucks, Patrick Carr. Any of those ring a bell? One. For most of us, probably not. One was a rope maker, one was an apprentice ivory worker, one was a sailor, a runaway slave, and an unemployed Irish immigrant. These are the 5 men who lost their lives in the Boston Massacre in 1770 when British soldiers fired upon a mob that had attacked them. Here's some more names for you. Joseph Allacock, Isaac Sears, James Otis, James Kinsey. Well, these were some of the lawyers and merchants who incited the mobs to riot. The same lawyers and politicians a decade later would create committees of safety that would jail any man or woman who did not swear allegiance to the Continental Congress. You see, history plays tricks on us. The Sons of Liberty we learn about in school, we remember because they were noble, virtuous, and mostly well-to-do. George Washington and Ben Franklin did not produce the kind of rage and violence that created the Revolution. That energy existed in thousands of common people, tradesmen, mechanics, and farmers that were disenfranchised by the colonial governments from the time of the French and Indian Wars. The income gap between the rich and the poor in America, aggravated by an unfair tax structure and inadequate money supply, was bound to be increased by the Stamp Act in 1765. It was easy for politicians to gain power by leading the working men to protest against it. One of my favorite quotes that I came across in my research is from William Franklin, who was the royal governor of New Jersey in 1765, at the time of the Stamp Act. In a letter to his father, William says, "As is usual with mobs, when they once feel their power, they have gone much beyond what was desired by those who first raised them." I'll read that again for you. "As is usual with mobs, when they once feel their own power, they have gone much beyond what was desired by those who first raised them." Well, the American mobs kept going beyond what was desired, and the British redcoats pushed back far beyond what was required, and so, naturally, there was a war. The American Revolution was not an orderly mobilization led by great and noble gentlemen in wigs and knee breeches. It was a mob scene, from the looting and burning of private homes over the Stamp Act to the carnage at Lexington and Concord. Our great and noble gentlemen, Washington, Adams, and Franklin, did their best to make it as orderly as possible, but they did not themselves make it. The American Revolution was a populist uprising and revolt. It was surely justified, but might have been avoided if the British Parliament had not so badly managed things. I'll come to my point. What can we learn from this populist uprising that led to the American Revolution? Just this. If it could happen to literate Americans more likely to settle their differences with rational arguments than with gunpowder, it could certainly happen to Americans today. We no longer have literacy equal to the challenges of democracy. The America of 1765 was far better defended against demagoguery and tyranny than the America of 2017. And yet it happened. The revolution, with all of its forgotten tyrannies, happened despite the efforts of men like Benjamin Franklin and William Franklin to prevent it. The American Revolution is a cautionary tale, a clear warning to us of the dangers of demagoguery thriving in the income gap between the rich and the poor. And it must also alert us to the dangers of a broken educational system. The Loyal Son is my 8th book of biography. I wrote 3 books about Lincoln, and then I wrote the book about Bob Dylan, and then I spent 5 years on this project. And this was certainly the most difficult to write, and that might be the subject of another talk on another day, why it was difficult. A question I'm often asked about a book is this one. What did you discover that most surprised you? Well, with this particular book, I'm not going to answer that question directly because in discovering it to you, I would be spoiling some of the pleasures of reading The Loyal Son, which is the element of surprise. But instead, I'll talk about a major theme of the book, a thing that surprised me and shocked me, and is related to what I've already touched upon, the violence that is in the fabric of American populism. I encountered so much of this in the 18th century that I might have become numb to it. Instead, I continued to be shocked. I guess that's one of the traits of the historian, this aptitude for amazement and wonder. I never ceased to be amazed at the Paxton hoodlums' cruelty in killing innocent Indians, or the Indians scalping the innocent Moravians, just as I'm always surprised by George Washington's unexpected kindnesses. Anyway, as I'm sure you know, my book is about Ben Franklin and his son William, and how they went their separate ways during the Revolution. Father and son had been inseparable, partners in work and play for most of their lives. They shared the same political ideals until about the time of the Boston Tea Party, when Ben became a revolutionary. William remained loyal to the king, famously loyal, probably the most influential Tory in the colonies. He clung to his position as governor of New Jersey long after the other royal governors had stepped aside or joined the revolution. He was imprisoned for this in 1776, released in a prisoner's exchange in 1778. He was sent to New York City, which was then occupied by the British Army, and it was also a haven for 10,000 American loyalists who were no longer welcome in their own homes. In New York, William continued to serve the king, mobilizing American loyalists as a fighting force that might supplement the British Army. 3 years later, General Cornwallis surrendered to General Washington at Yorktown. And this was widely understood then as now to be virtually the end of the war. The formal peace treaty would not be signed until 1783, but by 1781, the military situation of the British Army in America was hopeless. And yet the fighting continued. There are a number of reasons for this, but the formal reason had to do with the conditions of the surrender at Yorktown, which were widely published. Article 10 of the surrender denies American loyalists the immunity from punishment that is guaranteed to foreign soldiers. The loyalists were to be treated as criminals. George Washington himself was not altogether pleased with this. William Franklin and his friends were horrified. At Yorktown, they basically had been offered up as a sacrifice for the British and Hessian soldiers who fought there. Now I'm going to read you just a few pages of the book, an incident of that civil war of retribution that followed the Civil War, that followed the Revolutionary War that we studied in school. Hoping to gain some tool of leverage for his refugees, William Franklin begged his commander-in-chief to issue a public letter addressed to General Washington and the Congress, vowing retaliation. If any American taken prisoner at Yorktown was executed, the British would square accounts by hanging a rebel prisoner in New York. Nothing less than retributive justice, he advised, would restore confidence and a sense of security among the Tories. General Clinton, the British general, would do nothing of the kind. He would not publicly criticize his own general for the conditions of his surrender, Nor would he make a public policy of the Mosaic rule of an eye for an eye. General Clinton knew very well that retributive justice would follow inevitably from civil war. As so many suffering patriots and Tories would live to tell, soldiers driven mad by violence and hunger, innocent families caught in the crossfire, widows and orphans. The war of rebellion was over, but the Civil War would rage on. While Benjamin was in France making the peace, William Franklin was fighting for his life and the lives of the king's subjects. They had no choice, these men with prices on their heads. And despite General Clinton's gloom, the Loyalists still hoped the British might win the war. If this seems irrational, so it was. Sane men were out of their element. Governor Franklin reported to Parliament that Cornwallis's failure had come not from military disadvantage, but from blundering, delay, and failure to work with the American Loyalists. He believed that he and his men could do better. That very day, a convoy of associated Loyalists was under sail down to Tom's River, deep in Monmouth County, to destroy a nest of rebel pirates, the garrison of the terrible Jack Huddy. This Captain Huddy was a vicious, disowned Quaker, felon and troublemaker, who led raids on British merchants, capturing and sometimes murdering Loyalists as the spirit moved him. He liked to boast of his cruel deeds, and some say that Huddy looked like a pirate with a black beard, a headscarf, and an earring. Captain Huddy commanded a small fort guarding Dover, a port town 60 miles south of New York. On the hill overlooking Tom's River, the fort was a square palisade, 7 feet high, manned by 26 rebels, with cannons mounted on the 4 corners. The deep harbor there with its marsh grasses made a perfect base of ambush for pirates like Huddy, who would lie in wait for vessels sailing north with arms or treasure. By the end of March 1782, Captain Huddy had caused such loss of life and property that the Associated Loyalists vowed to put him out of business. They sent 3 armed boats bearing 80 seamen under guard of a brig shipping 30 more soldiers ready to fight. The convoy arrived near the mouth of Tom's River on March 23rd. A sentry spied their landing at midnight and ran to awaken Huddy. When the Tories attacked at dawn, the rebels behind the notched palisades were armed with muskets, pistols, and long pikes. In the fight that ensued, the sailors swarmed over the fort, losing 9 men to bullets and bayonets before killing 7 rebels. Huddy escaped into the village, running from house to house as the Tories set fire to one after another. They burned the tavern and the warehouses and every home in Dover except for 2 houses belonging to Tory friends. At last they found Huddy barricaded in a grist mill along with a local judge. The 2 men laid down their arms and were led in leg irons to the Tory ship bound for New York. At last, Captain Huddy, the man who had hanged young Stephen Edwards on a whim, was a prisoner of war. Arriving in New York on April 1st, he was held there in a military jail. That same day, rumors came from Monmouth County that the Loyalist Philip White had been captured off the coast of Snag Swamp and tortured. White reminded everyone of the late victim, Stephen Edwards, his Loyalist kinsman from Shrewsbury. 27, Philip, too, had a wife, a son, and a baby daughter. A carpenter, He also ran a privateer brig called the Wasp. This was the same man who had joined a prior Tory raid on Shrewsbury that took the life of rebel John Russell's father while wounding his little boy. It's a lot of names, but you'll see how this turns out. Now, Philip White's ship was anchored off Long Branch. He was about to board her when a party of rebel horsemen took him by surprise. One of these happened to be John Russell Jr., the son of the man he had murdered. As John Russell chased Philip White over the sedge and dunes, White turned to fire his musket and killed one of his rebel pursuers. The others captured him. John Russell Jr., severe and vengeful, was in command of the guards that led the Tory Philip White from the beach to Freehold. There he was to be held in the courthouse jail. It satisfied Russell's desire for revenge that Philip White did not get to Freehold alive or even in one piece. Russell and two other soldiers pierced him with swords until he ran. Russell then overtook White 3 miles from Freehold and murdered him there piecemeal. What remained of the young husband and father lay bleeding upon a long table in the Monmouth courthouse for the gaping mob as a public show and a warning to traitors. The sight was so grisly that when the victim's sister drove over from Shrewsbury with a coffin to bury him, she was turned away. The agonizing martyrdom of Philip White coincided with the Loyalists' worst fears of persecution. They wanted revenge. And as news of White's murder reached William Franklin, so did demands for Joshua Huddy. So Franklin agreed that as soon as he had custody of Huddy, he would hand him over. He would entrust him to one Captain Richard Lippincott, a commissioned officer from the Board of Associated Loyalists. When Lippincott reported to the board one morning in April, William Franklin, the president, was absent. Captain Lippincott took a hearty interest in Huddy's fate because he, Lippincott, had been a lifelong friend of the murdered Philip White. Captain Lippincott informed the assembled board that another friend, Clayton Tilton, was a prisoner in Freehold jail, about to be hanged. He wanted an order to remove Joshua Huddy and 2 other prisoners in chains down to Sandy Hook, where he would use them to bargain for the jailed Tilton's freedom. A little later, William Franklin came through the door, greeted everyone, and glanced at the document on the table. But Lippincott had another note, folded note, he wanted the governor to read. He pressed it upon Franklin and asked him, would this do? Would this do? At this, the vice president of the board intervened angrily, telling the captain, put that scribbling away. And so the captain, Lippincott, went away with his orders to Provost Jail. There, the marshal bound Joshua Huddy and 2 others over to Lippincott and his company, headed for the bay in a schooner. But instead of running the 3 rebels straight to Freehold to negotiate the prisoner exchange, Captain Lippincott stowed them aboard an armed ship, the Britannia, anchored off Sandy Hook. The ship's captain agreed to hold them. Lippincott then set off with his soldiers to free Tilton by force of arms from Freehold prison. But it didn't work out. Failing in the rescue attempt, Captain Lippincott, in a rage, returned to the Britannia, and he asked for one prisoner, Joshua Huddy. What happened in the next few hours on the beach at Gravelly Point was witnessed by 24 men. The April sunlight on the hills behind them, strong light upon the sand and sea. They would never forget the weirdness of the scene. Carpenters hammered up a gallows of stout planks above a barrel. They fastened a noose to the top brace. The rope from the Britannia made a curious shadow on the sand. Joshua Huddy was given a quill and paper and invited to write his last will upon the barrelhead. He wrote it, maintaining an admirable poise. Then most of the men stood back to watch Huddy, Lippincott, and a black slave in a queer pantomime against the sea and sky. Huddy and Lippincott were conversing softly. There was no sign or sound of anger, no pleading or condemnation. The slave put the noose around Huddy's neck and tightened it. Huddy climbed up on the barrel. He put his hand out to Richard Lippincott for him to shake, and he did. The black man pulled the rope tight, fastened it, and kicked over the barrel. There have been hundreds of murders, just as barbarous on both sides of the conflict. But this was the one that got the attention of George Washington, Henry Clinton, America, and all of Europe. The same paper that Captain Lippincott had unfolded at the board meeting was pinned to Huddy's shirt as he hung on the gallows. It read, "We, the refugees, having long with grief beheld the cruel murders of our brethren, and finding nothing but such measures daily carried into execution, we therefore determined not to suffer without taking vengeance for the numerous cruelties, and thus begin, having made use of Captain Huddy as the first object to present to your view. And we further determine to hang man for man while there is a refugee existing." Up goes Huddy for Philip White. Well, some of you students of American history may know that this was the incident that started the famous Asgill affair. George Washington was called upon to hang a British prisoner in retaliation for the execution of Joshua Huddy. The British prisoner who was chosen by lot was Charles Asgill, a very handsome 19-year-old lieutenant, who also happened to be the son of the mayor of London. So George Washington's dilemma became famous in Europe, to Ben Franklin's dismay, because it nearly ruined the peace that he was on the verge of making. You'll learn all about this when you read The Loyal Son. The passage that I just read to you, a scene from the War of Retribution, which continued the War of Independence, it recalls one of the more appalling instances of deliberate cruelty and violence that had no defensible cause. It was one of many. America had won the war. Huddy was lynched in a savage violation of martial law. Some of the men involved believed they were doing the right thing, the necessary thing in retaliating, but these soldiers were the victims of desperation and isolation. You may recall my remark that Americans are naturally kind when they're not desperate or isolated. The American loyalists of 1782 were desperate and isolated for the reasons I've explained. And their enemies, the provincial patriots of New Jersey, were also desperate and isolated. And these factions did unspeakable things to each other. I discovered this chain of events in obscure accounts of the period, and then I had to tell the story. I found it utterly shocking, as I think you will. This is a part of American history that doesn't make it into the history books, by and large. I came upon it in the course of learning about Ben Franklin and his tragic relationship with his son, William. William had something to do with the hanging of Joshua Huddy, although he cannot be blamed for it. His poor father, 3,000 miles away in France, would have to deal with the fallout of George Washington's dilemma, the condemnation of Lieutenant Charles Asgill in retaliation for the hanging of Huddy. What began as an international embarrassment and scandal came face to face with the private tragedy of Ben Franklin's quarrel with his son. This was a story I would have to tell as well as I could, and I offer it with humility, but without apology in The Loyal Son. If you want to understand our history and the American character, you have to see all of it. The good, the evil, the splendid, and the sordid. You have to go beyond the scenes of George Washington crossing the Delaware and that pantheon of heroes in the State House in Philadelphia on the 4th of July, reading the Declaration of Independence. All of these things are real, but you cannot understand the nobility of our heroes without knowing the desperation of the common people. Thank you. So I'll take questions. I like questions, and sometimes I can answer them. Be sure that if you ask a question, you go to the aisle. There's a speaker, there's a mic there and a mic there. Questions? Yes, sir.
You said that Ben Franklin's known to be honest. What's the evidence? How do you know that?
Well, that's a really good question. I think that his generosity of spirit. I mean, think about the fact that he never looked to patent so many of these inventions that he had. That if you're going to be a businessman, I think in any period of history, and you're going to borrow money, and you're going to, in order to finance things, you're going to have a lot of business dealings. As much as he had with that many people, you have to be trusted. And people who are not trustworthy get caught in lies, and that's something we don't find in the vast general correspondence of Franklin and his circle. There's just no evidence that he was not trustworthy, and then the fact that so many of the the colonial legislatures trusted him to plead their cause in England during the 1760s and 1770s. You don't do that unless you can really trust the person. So, yes, sir.
Thanks for a fascinating discussion about the American Revolution, particularly appropriate since my friends and I just returned a few months ago from visiting 13 American Revolutionary War sites, battle sites, in the backcountry of South Carolina, where loyalists and patriots could really do to each other. My question for you is about your statement that the American Revolution was a mob scene, that although George Washington and Ben Franklin did their best to make things a bit more orderly, it was a mob scene, and this in a country that was more likely to settle arguments with rational discourse. And then you went on and said it could happen today. And I wonder if you could address how it could happen today, given the 250 years of social evolution, cultural evolution, media evolution, but most particularly constitutional evolution, the fact that there was no constitution then, and that what Washington and Franklin and Madison and Hamilton did was to establish a way of life and a system of government that had tremendous checks that do check and tremendous balances that do balance. Thanks.
You raise a very good point, and certainly the evolution of the American character as a result of the Constitution is something that mitigates against the sort of tyrannies and mob violence that occurred during the Revolution. It's a very good point. The problem, as I see it, is the fact that we don't have this, as a people, we do not have these skills of rational argument in order to settle disputes that we had then. The Constitution, I think, is under constant, is in danger because of the failure to argue logically, and so that's the real danger that I see. Other questions? Yes.
Do you mind if I ask from here? Can you hear me?
I'll repeat it if
Do you have a sense of why there was this split between Franklin and his son? Was it inevitable that there would be this political split? What was the psychological context? Because I understand that they were close. Was it influenced by their personal relationship, or was it strictly a political separation?
that's a very good question. The question is, to what extent was the split between the Franklins a result of the psychology, the dynamic between the two personally, and to what extent was it simply caused by the political situation? And certainly both things played a part. Let me just briefly address the personal dynamic. I do talk in my book about there was a level of competition, mostly from the older man's side. Ben Franklin, I believe, felt that he was, in a sense, in competition with his son. His son was fantastically successful in his 30s and 40s, and Benjamin Franklin was financially very successful and world famous, but he still felt a kind of competition with his son. So I think that was part of it, played into it. But the fact that they lived such very different lives during the 1760s and 1770s, when William Franklin was the governor of New Jersey, he was living in America, he was basically had replaced his father as pater familias in taking care of Deborah the wife, and the daughter. They were living in different worlds. Benjamin Franklin was, for most of that time, was living in England, where he had a whole other a kind of surrogate family there. And then a number of things happened to Benjamin Franklin that alienated him from Parliament. A terrible scandal having to do with purloined letters, and so things got worse and worse and worse for Benjamin Franklin in England, and you got to remember 3,000 miles in those days, across the ocean. So a lot of the split had to do with, or the alienation had to do with it. They were living in different worlds. Yes.
Actually, I wanted to go back to the beginning of the story almost. I hadn't realized. How is it that Benjamin and William had such a close relationship given the shame of illegitimacy in culture at the time?
There wasn't all that much, well, let's put it this way. In those days, men of the middle class and of the upper class frequently raised children, particularly sons, not so much daughters, but they would raise sons out of wedlock. And in Philadelphia in the 1750s 40s. Well, first of all, most people didn't know that William Franklin was not the natural son of Deborah, or if they did know, they didn't care. They kind of just overlooked it. So he was raised in Philadelphia in the 1740s and 1750s, just as if he had been a legitimate son, with all of the privileges, and he courted women of the upper classes, and so there wasn't all that much stigma. Now later, during the war, the early years of in the early 1770s, Benjamin Franklin's enemies would use this as a stick to beat him. Yeah. Other questions? Thank you very much. Thank you for coming.